Hello, everyone. So welcome to the first lecture of the Tradition of Critique course this semester, in which we will start with Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Now, this is the first text that we'll be reading, and you've already, I've sent the text to you and you should have read it by now, so we'll discuss it in detail in class. But in the pre-recorded lecture, I thought I would do a more of, well, I'd give you the background to Rousseau. We have already talked about a background to the course in our last class. So today we are just going to do a bit of a background to Rousseau. So a bit of the history, well, not too much of it, but a bit of the history, bit of his, a bit of a discussion of his other works. And I'll give you some sort of pointers towards concepts that I find especially interesting and the way I would read our chosen text, which is Discourse on the Origins and Foundations of Inequality amongst Men, right? So I'll give you a few pointers and then I'll end by talking a bit about, so what next? I mean, if we have figured out, all the problems that have caused inequality, as, Rousseau sort of explains it. So what would Rousseau's solution to this be? Yeah, and what is his solution? And so we'll discuss the other text, which I did want to prescribe to you, but given the constraints of like a single semester, so I chose this the second discourse, which is the discourse on inequality, rather than the social contract, which, I mean, if you have the time, please do read it, and it's a wonderful text. Anyway, so to start, this course is called The Tradition of Critique, which I actually picked from a course title of one of a lecture series that I did when I was in my MA, when I was doing my MA in Nottingham. And there I was doing an MA and then later a PhD in critical theory. And I found that this worked like as an excellent background to the text that I was reading. Now, that course was more of a lecture series you would go and attend, and you didn't have any prescribed readings per se. But to have a selection of texts out here that you could that you could engage with and have go a bit more in depth into and discuss would be great. So as you know, we have here a series of texts. So first one is from Rousseau, next from Kant, then Hegel, next Wollstonecraft, then Hegel, then Marx, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Freud, right? So that's a series. So our first thinker that we'll be looking at is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Right, he was born in 1712 in what was then the Republic of Geneva, and he's really proud of this, right? So he sort of he was very proud of his Genevan origins. Later, he was kicked out of there for various reasons, but he had a strong sort of Genevan identity. He was francophone, so in Switzerland, as you know, many different languages are spoken. He was a francophone philosopher and had a more of a wandering life. So he, very itinerant because basically he got into trouble with lots of different authorities because of his books. So he did sort of travel. And so that's a picture of him. Well, actually, it's a painting, as you can imagine, no photography at that time. So that's a painting on him. Of him, in which he looks very sort of benign and kind and sweet, and I think he's way more complicated than that. But yeah, right. So he was a writer generally. I've said, like he wrote a novel. So Julie ou la Nouvelle Héloïse is one of the first best-selling novels of the time. He wrote more novels, but yeah, Julie is the best-selling one. And epistolary novel, amazing to read if you get the chance, if you're interested. The Confessions, which is probably one of his most famous literary works now, because it's highly autobiographical. And those of you who have worked on Derrida, for example, would have read one of his analysis of an episode from that. But anyway, so you have Les Confessions. Okay, I don't know where to put this. Les Rêveries du Promeneur Solitaire. It's a philosophical text, but also a literary text. It's very autobiographical. It's a set of autobiographical essays, is how I'd put it. It's one of the most beautiful sort of pieces of prose writing of the time that one would come across. So like like his style, like if nothing else, if you read French, and even in English translation, so the text that I've prescribed to you, this one, the translator which is Gurevich, has done an excellent job, and you get the rhythm of the Rousseauian sentences. But yeah, if you can read French, then would be great. Do try to read him in the original. Amazing stylist, right? And he wrote a play called The Narcissist. So we'd be looking at one little passage from the preface to the play Narcissus. Anyway, so lots of literary works. If you're interested, do read them. Very readable as well. And but better known really now for his political works or philosophical works, but mainly he worked in political philosophy. So he did not develop an ontology, and did not go into talking about ontology and epistemology. He's a political philosopher, right? And the text that he is famous for is the social contract, which we just talked about, earlier. And his sort of chef d'oeuvre really is both that and the second discourse, or the discourse on the origin and the foundations of inequality amongst men, right? Which is a second discourse. He had a first discourse, which was on a discourse on the science and the arts, and this is what propelled him into fame, really. So he wrote that in 1750. And answering a question to the Academy of Dijon, and there he he won the prize by going against the grain. So we'll discuss it more in detail. And then he became known to the Enlightenment philosophers of that time, really. So especially Diderot, who was an encyclopedist. He was they had this plan of making this big encyclopedia, Diderot and d'Alembert, and they got together, the many different thinkers of the time to contribute, and Rousseau contributed on music. So he was also a musician, actually. More than a musician, he was a composer. So he wrote this opera called Le Devin du Village, which I think the king himself watched, and he wanted to offer Rousseau a lifelong pension, which Rousseau refused. Rousseau was a complicated fellow, but yeah, and he, in fact, he developed his own style of notation, I think, after Rameau. I think, if I'm remembering it correctly, I don't know. And he at that time he was a music copyist, so he did sort of try and make money for a bit by copying music, and being a tutor, being secretary. I don't know if he was a tutor, but being a secretary to different sort of aristocratic families. So his life was, he was not from the upper classes, but he had all the aspirations towards that, and that caused him a lot of pain and trouble as well, because at the same time he's like democracy, egalitarianism, and at the same time there's this aspiration for the aristocracy and aristocratic women especially, right? So he had this kind of double sort of relation to that. He is like an attraction towards the aristocratic way of life, but at the same time a repulsion towards the bourgeois money-making attitude, which as he perceived it, and which even amongst the aristocracy, like he did see it. So like he's a complex fellow. Anyway, so this is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. As you can see, he died in 1778, before the French Revolution, and he had a huge influence on the French Revolution. So Robespierre apparently used to carry, I think, a copy of the social contract, or maybe it was his constitution for one of his constitutions. Anyway, so he carried it around everywhere, right? And Rousseau himself would have been a bit more ambivalent about a revolution from his writings, some of the things he has said. But yeah, so he had this thing for sorry. So he had this huge influence on the French Revolution, and huge influence later on. Well, two of the people that we'd be covering right after this would be Mary Wollstonecraft and Emmanuel Kant. Now, Mary Wollstonecraft, lived during the French Revolution, and she wrote first The Rights of Man, and then she was like, well, vindication of the rights of women. If you notice, and as you can see, discourse on the origin and the foundations of inequality among men, right? Now, philosophers often argue that this could be, the men is a general term which includes women as well. But as Wollstonecraft pointed out, and very rightly so, that's not very evident. And I think they did not really think of women when they said, all these philosophers, and Rousseau also clarified it. For example, when he wrote his book Emile on education, which is this treatise on education, very, very popular at that time, well known at that time. He got a lot of flack for it as well, but well known at that time. In that, he talks about, what kind of education, what kind of system of education will bring up the right kind of citizen, which is Emile. And then he starts talking about the education of Sophie, the girl, and she is supposed to be a secondary being, really, in this strong Aristotelian sense. She doesn't have the same rights and reason as the man does. So she doesn't need the same education. She needs to be brought up to be helpmeet of a sort to man. And so Wollstonecraft, whom we'll read later, picks up on that and gets fairly irritated. And as I said, rightly so. Then we'll be covering Kant. So we'll be going to Kant after that. And as you know, with Kant as well, Rousseau had a huge influence on, the Kantian notion of, of society and politics, and even morality of human nature. So I mean, we'll see. The text we'll be reading from Kant, which is what's it called, on cosmopolitan history. Any case, my brain is sort of going blank right now. Again, huge influence. And then Hegel next, master and slave dialectic. So Rousseau's huge influence on Hegel is what we'd see after Kant. Though we'll not be looking at the master and slave dialectic, we'll be looking at introduction to the philosophy of history. But there a different kind of influence on the idea of change and shift. So we'll look at that. And then we will be looking at Marx, which, of course, one of the texts that I've shared with you, I think, is Andrew Levine's. But anyway, so the Rousseauist egalitarian vision had and still continues to have influence on the Marxist egalitarian vision. So massive influence there. Anyway, we've talked about all this, so I don't want to sort of waste too much time doing this, but yeah, sorry, first 15 minutes of introduction to Rousseau, and maybe I'll make a second video so that you are, so that you're not stuck with just one single long video to watch on all of it, right? So yeah, I'll just stop and start.